The gates slam shut. Dust swirls in the afternoon heat. 50,000 voices once rose in a single breath, then fell silent. Beneath the sand, a man waits, steel in hand, his pulse pounding beneath the roar, not for Rome, not for gods, for applause. The arena is quiet now. The stone cracked, the arches broken, but it listens still, to ghosts, to memory, to power. You've heard the myths. Gladiators always died. The thumb ruled life. The Colosseum was just about blood. But history is rarely that simple. Rome never built anything without reason, and this arena had many. This is not just a monument. It is a machine of spectacle, of control, of politics dressed in violence. From the emperor who raised it, to the crowd who screamed within it, to the men and women who fought beneath it. This is the Colosseum. Let the fire settle. Let your thoughts slow. Let history begin. Chapter 1. The birth of a giant. There were hundreds of amphitheatres across the Roman world. From the windswept frontiers of Britannia to the red sands of Africa, these massive structures echoed with the sounds of cheers, hooves, and steel. Some were carved into hillsides. Others stood free, like enormous stone drums. Each was a place of spectacle, where animals were hunted, men fought, and power was performed. But among them all, one would come to define the idea of Roman grandeur. A monument not only to engineering, but to the empire's very soul. Its construction began in the aftermath of chaos. The year was 72 AD. Just a few years earlier, the empire had teetered on collapse. After the suicide of the infamous Emperor Nero, known for his cruelty, theatricality, and obsession with absolute control, Rome had spiraled into a violent struggle for succession. In a single year, 4 emperors rose and fell. Armies turned on each other. Provinces rebelled. The capital itself saw blood in the streets. From this turmoil emerged a man named Titus Flavius Vespasianus, better known to history as Vespasian I. He was no patrician. Born into a family of equestrian rank, he had risen through military service, earning his reputation in the conquest of Britannia, and later during the brutal suppression of the Jewish revolt in Judea. Tough, practical, and plain-spoken, Vespasian was a soldier more than a politician. And yet he would found a new dynasty, the Flavian line, and begin rebuilding Rome from the ashes of civil war. At the center of this effort stood a project of immense symbolism. Vespasian's predecessor, Nero, had left behind a scar in the middle of Rome. The Domus Aurea, his golden house, was a vast palace complex, filled with gardens, fountains, and an artificial lake. At its heart stood a massive bronze statue of himself as the sun god. To the Roman people, it was a monstrous display of ego. Nero had taken land meant for temples and housing and turned it into a private fantasy world. After his death, it remained a hollow reminder of tyranny. Vespasian tore it down. The lake was drained, the pleasure halls dismantled. And where Nero had once built for himself, Vespasian now built for the people. There, on the cleared ground, he began the construction of a new kind of monument, the Flavian amphitheatre. What we now call the Colosseum was not a temple or palace, but something uniquely Roman, a space of public power where the people were both audience and instrument of imperial control. Built from travertine hauled from the quarries of Tivoli, the Colosseum rose in concentric rings of stone, bound together with iron clamps. Its 3 levels of arches were framed in classical orders: Doric on the ground floor, Ionic above, and Corinthian at the top. Tunnels and staircases allowed as many as 50,000 or more spectators to enter and take their places in minutes, and every seat had meaning. Senators sat closest to the arena, where they could be seen and see in return. Roman citizens filled the middle ranks. Women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor watched from the upper levels, far from the action, but still within the grand shadow of Roman power. Vespasian did not live to see its completion. That honor fell to his eldest son, Titus I, who would later become emperor himself and preside over the games that marked its official opening. But by the time Vespasian died in 79 AD, the Colosseum was already becoming what he intended. Not just a building, but a statement. A triumph of stone over vanity, of empire over ego, of Rome reborn. The Colosseum was more than architecture. It was message, ritual, and machinery. Every stone and corridor was engineered not only to impress, but to function, cleanly, efficiently, and under the weight of thousands. Its outer facade bore no sculpture, no decoration, no gods carved in marble. It needed none. The structure itself, rising from what had once been the private lake of a tyrant, told its own story. It was Rome. At its heart lay the arena, the harina, named for the sand that coated its wooden floor. This sand was more than practical. It was symbolic. It absorbed blood. It covered mess. And it reminded everyone watching that they were witnessing more than games. They were witnessing death, repackaged as ritual. Beneath that sand lay a world of darkness. The hippodrome, a maze of tunnels, lifts, trapdoors, cages, and holding pens, allowed the shows to unfold with stunning precision. Lions could appear from beneath the earth. Gladiators could rise on platforms without warning. Scenery could be changed in minutes. It was a machine, and like all Roman machines, it required discipline, planning, and the quiet work of unseen hands. But what filled the arena was more than spectacle. It was ideology. The games, munera, as they were called, were not merely for amusement. They were acts of power, funded by emperors or elite citizens to display generosity, dominance, and control. Gladiators, many of them enslaved or condemned, were trained not just to fight, but to perform. Their battles followed rules. Their deaths were real. And in the stands, Roman identity was reinforced. Through violence, yes, but also through order. Every event was tightly managed. A day at the games might begin with wild beast hunts called venaciones, leopards from Numidia, bears from the forests of the north, elephants from Africa, all captured, transported, and killed for display. At midday came executions, rebels, criminals, or prisoners of war condemned to die before the eyes of thousands. And then, in the afternoon, the gladiators entered. Armed in traditional styles, Thracians, Samnites, Myrmilones, and others, they represented Rome's conquered enemies, now weaponized for its pleasure. It was not mindless. It was memory, curated through violence. Even the seating plan served a purpose. The emperor, when present, sat in a private box near the arena floor. High above, under the canopy of sails called the velorium, the plebs shouted and drank and placed bets. They knew their place. Everyone did. It was, in its way, a ritual of reassurance, each class seated where it belonged, each body placed by rank, each eye trained on the center, where life and death danced. The Colosseum did not civilize violence. It structured it, and in doing so, it brought Rome into focus, not the Rome of senators and poets, but the Rome of crowd, rule, and order. Beneath the arches, no citizen was alone. They were Roman, part of something immense and brutal and strangely beautiful. It was more than a building, it was a mirror. And Rome, looking into it, saw itself. Chapter 2. The Emperor's Theatre. The Colosseum was a gift, but it was also a message. Its arches framed more than entrances, they framed power. Its arena was more than sand. It was a mirror, where emperors watched and were watched in return. To the crowds, the Colosseum was entertainment. To the emperors, it was theatre. a place to shape public memory, and no emperor understood this better than the man who opened it. Titus I had been born into a rising family, the son of Vespasian, who had climbed from provincial obscurity to become emperor after the chaos of civil war. But unlike his father, Titus was already famous before the purple robes. He had served as a general during the Jewish revolt in the east, laying siege to Jerusalem and ultimately destroying the Second Temple. His triumph in Rome had been lavish: gold from the temple, slaves from Judea, and a newly built arch to celebrate the conquest. To many, he was a hero. To others, a reminder of Rome's hard edge. But his reign began under a cloud. In the year 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted without warning. The cities of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabiae were swallowed in ash and stone. Tens of thousands were lost. And just as recovery began, Rome itself was struck by fire and plague. It was a time when faith in the gods faltered, and the people looked to their emperor for reassurance. Titus responded not with monuments or proclamations, but with presence. He funded relief, opened the treasury, and took personal responsibility for the aid. But even more, he gave the Roman people something they had never seen before: the completed Colosseum. The games began with scale, not subtlety. 100 consecutive days of celebration, gladiator contests, wild beast hunts, staged naval battles. Yes, the arena was flooded to simulate sea combat, though how precisely this was achieved remains debated. Thousands of animals died. Prisoners were executed in theatrical reenactments of myth. A man dressed as Orpheus was torn apart by lions while playing the lyre. Each act was layered, part story, part sentence, part spectacle. The emperor watched it all from the imperial podium, a marble platform just above the arena floor. There was no curtain, no protective screen. The emperor was visible to all, and that visibility was not tradition, it was power. In Rome, to be seen was to rule. But it was not Titus who turned the Colosseum into a masterpiece of control. That task fell to his younger brother and successor, Domitian I, a colder, more calculating ruler. Domitian distrusted the Senate, surrounded himself with informants, and ruled by fear as much as by law. And he turned the Colosseum into a machine. It was Domitian who expanded downward, completing the hypodrome, the vast underworld of tunnels, cages, and hidden lifts. He added secret passages for performers and guards. He commissioned a new training school for gladiators, just east of the arena. Everything became more efficient, more dramatic, more precise. And it was under his reign that the games took on a sharper tone. They were not merely festive, they were cautionary. Those who offended the regime might find themselves not in court, but in the arena. The line between justice and performance blurred, yet the crowds still came. In sweltering heat or biting rain, they packed the stone seats, arranged by rank, identity, and fate. Senators in the front, slaves in the back, the poor somewhere in between. And they watched, not only for sport, but for order, for the spectacle of Roman control dressed in blood and applause. The Colosseum was no longer new. It had become something else, a sacred ritual, a public reassurance. And the emperor, whether loved or feared, sat at its center, watched by thousands, framed by stone. The gate stood open, but few dared enter. The amphitheatre loomed like a riddle. It had no name, no proclamation, no inscription to declare its purpose. The emperor had not spoken. No games were scheduled, no performers listed. Yet the structure was ready, cleaned, prepared, polished to a harsh, silent perfection. Here and there, people wandered close. Market girls with baskets, elderly men in wool cloaks, stooping at the knees. Children peered between the columns and were quickly pulled back by cautious mothers. The archers gaped, dozens of them, as if waiting to breathe. But nothing came. No music, no banners, not even guards to keep order. Some stepped inside. Slowly. Shoes scuffed on travertine as they entered the outer ring. The air within was dry and echoing. Each footstep whispered upward, bouncing off vaulted ceilings and empty benches. A few brave souls climbed the steps. Others simply stared and left. The smell of dust lingered, lime and mortar, iron, old rope. Somewhere deep within, a pigeon fluttered. Its wings echoed like distant applause. There was no sign of what would come next. No schedule, no priest, no script. Just the architecture itself, tiered, calculating, immense. A fruit vendor sat alone near the western wall, peeling a fig in silence. He hadn't sold anything since sunrise. He wasn't sure why he stayed. He just did. Inside, beneath the canopy framework, a single figure swept the arena floor with a worn broom. Back and forth. The sand had already been smoothed the day before. It didn't matter. He kept sweeping. In a corridor below, a worker paused by a ladder he was meant to carry out. He stared at the stone, felt its weight. Something about the place made his chest tight. This wasn't the joy of a festival. It wasn't the thrill of a show. It was something else. Chapter 3. The Long March. The Colosseum had opened, but the Empire still held its breath. No emperor stood beneath its awnings. No festival paraded through its arches. The games would come, yes, but not yet. Not fully. For now, it waited. And across the provinces, another theatre stirred. From the damp barracks of Britannia to the sunburnt walls of Palmyra, orders spread like smoke. Not carved in triumphal stone, nor shouted by heralds in city squares, but carried quietly, slipped into the hands of tribunes, unrolled before weary officers. Troops were to move. Entire units. Auxiliaries, sentries, detachments, scouts. Some transferred, some recalled, others simply vanished from the rosters, marked for the capital. It was not one march, but hundreds. A slow ripple pulled from the edges of empire, drawn toward Rome like iron toward a forge. Legion by legion, detachment by detachment, they came. Through sodden fields and frost-cracked bridges. Over volcanic ridges where the air burned thin and bitter. Across dry riverbeds where the water had forgotten to flow. Always marching. Not the proud cadence of conquest, but the bone-tired pace of obligation. Boots ground down to the nail. Caligae worn through at the toe. Shields lacquered with dirt, insignia faded to ochre streaks. The younger ones still joked. The older ones did not. The march swallowed laughter as it swallowed miles. In the far north, men trudged through snow too wet to freeze, pushing carts clogged with grain and frozen oil. In the east, where the sun punished the unshaded, camel-mounted scouts rode ahead to scour the road for thieves and missing stones. In Gaul, men passed the shattered remnants of civil wars long forgotten, camps where fires once burned, now mossed over memories. One standard-bearer crossed a battlefield where his uncle had fallen 20 years before. He didn't look up. Civilians watched from the sides of roads. Bakers, blacksmiths, old women selling garum from cracked jugs. No cheers, no applause, just stares. The Empire had called its sons home, and the silence of that summons clung heavier than any trumpet's call. One officer, lean and red-eyed from Syrian sands, passed a milestone just outside Ariminum. It read simply, Via Flavia. He stopped, read it again. The Flavians. Of course, it was always them. He spat to the dust and moved on. These were not legions summoned to glory. These were not men marching to expand the world. They were being drawn in, gathered, one by one, towards something still unnamed, still unfinished. Whatever Rome was building, it would be fed. They reached Rome in waves, not as a conquering force, not in parade formation, but in scattered trickles, their arrival absorbed into the daily pulse of the capital. No one announced them. There were no garlands, no shouts from balconies. One morning, an old woman selling onions at the Porta Capena found herself standing beside a man with a wolf crest on his shield, dust still clinging to his calves. Neither spoke. They came down the old roads like ghosts returning from forgotten wars. Via Aurelia, Via Latina, Via Appia, all now bore the weight of tired feet and iron wheels. Wagons rattled over stones that had been set when the Republic still stood. Horses refused the incline near the Calian hill and had to be led. Leather creaked, mules brayed, the air filled with the tang of sweat, hay, and old bronze. To the east, the first detachment from Apamea, modern Kalat al-Madik in Syria, arrived by ship at Ostia. The smell of salt and sun-rotted hemp clung to their cloaks. Their helmets were wrapped in cloth, the crests limp from humidity. As they disembarked, gulls circled above in silence, and fishermen paused to watch. At night, the soldiers gathered in loose circles, some in the city's outskirts, others in half-collapsed insulae rented by the hour. Fires crackled. Not for warmth, it was summer, but for company. Conversations were few. The crack of bread crusts echoed. Wine was passed around in dented cups. The city breathed around them, distant flute songs from the Subura, the murmur of Tiber's restless current, and the laughter of those too young or too poor to care about politics or empire. One morning, a centurion from Dacia, modern-day Romania, stood at the edge of the Campus Martius, watching a hawk circle high above. Beneath him stretched the newly levelled parade ground, churned mud where grass had once grown. Beyond that, cranes, timber scaffolds, blocks of travertine being carted into position. The Empire was not just calling its soldiers, it was making room for them. A boy approached, offering fruit in a reed basket, figs and sour plums, still dusty from the road. The centurion took one without a word and chewed slowly, eyes never leaving the construction site. The taste was bitter but alive. Across the city, in shaded atriums and marble baths, the patricians speculated. Was there a rebellion coming? A war in the east? Why were so many men arriving? But no one answered. The emperor had said nothing. The Senate offered nothing. The people heard nothing. And still they came, filling the cracks of a city not yet ready. Something was happening, and it had weight, not like a storm, but like the hush before it. Chapter 4. The Broken Alliance. Far from the Colosseum's cold and empty-tiered stone, another silence was forming. Not within marble walls, but across the roads and valleys of Italy, where old promises came undone. They came not as enemies, but as guests. Through the rising dust of the Roman roads came carts filled with children, with tired women holding infants, and warriors who once held frontier lines, now looking over their shoulders. These were not invaders. They were the allies of Rome, or so they had been. The Gothic refugees who once stood beside Rome on the Danubian frontier now trickled into Italy in growing numbers. Word had spread of safe passage, of land to till, of a promise made by generals and governors in the name of Rome herself. They followed these hopes toward a city they had never seen, toward a capital whose name still stirred awe. But there was no triumph in their march. The high summer air over the Italian countryside was heavy with the scent of dry grass and crushed olives. Fields shimmered in the heat. But the mood was not tranquil. Farmers watched from behind shuttered windows. Roman citizens along the roads gathered in uneasy knots. Whispers turned into shouts. Fear simmered behind every glance. Rome's promise of sanctuary had fractured. Officials, no longer bound by honor but by desperation, began to break their oaths. Rations once allotted to the Gothic columns were withheld. Troops were stationed not to protect, but to corral. Every town passed brought more suspicion, more tension. To some, these were not allies, but a slow-moving invasion in plain sight. Meanwhile, the capital stayed silent. Inside the Senate walls, arguments flared. Were they still Federati, sworn allies? Or had they become a burden, a threat in the heart of Italy? Some senators recalled how these very peoples had fought alongside Roman legions against the Huns and Persians. Others saw only the shadows of revolt. As the Gothic caravans approached the outskirts of the Roman hinterland, one thing became clear. The alliance was unraveling, not through open betrayal, but through quiet neglect. And that, perhaps, was worse. Because when alliances break in silence, war does not announce itself with a trumpet, but with a closed gate and a missing meal. They were a people without shelter, and they kept moving. What had begun as an organized migration now unraveled into uneven streams. Some Gothic families followed the roads that led toward Rome's quiet heart, still believing the promise might be fulfilled. Others veered away, into the hills, the forest margins, or the ruins of long-abandoned villas, where grass grew through cracked tile mosaics. The farther they walked, the quieter the countryside became. There were no messengers, no orders, no signs, only space and silence. By the time they reached the lowlands near Campania, the weather began to turn. Distant thunder rose like grinding stone. Cattle stood restless in the fields. The Gothic children were coughing now, wrapped in woven shawls damp from the rain. They could smell the sea, but it brought no comfort, just mist and the bitter scent of rotting wood. In one village they passed, the houses were still intact, but empty. A clay jug rested on a table. A child's toy lay half buried in mud. The wind moved the shutters, but not the people. Rome had promised safety, but no one had come. Even the Roman soldiers assigned to monitor the migrants grew uneasy. They camped on ridges above the Gothic columns, swords at their sides, expressions unreadable. They were not told what to expect, only to watch. But what they saw was not a threat. It was a slow unraveling, a nation without orders, a people stripped of dignity, now camped in the fields of their supposed protector. At night, the Gothic warriors sat around low fires, sharpening blades, not in defiance, but in memory. They remembered what they had once been: cavalry, scouts, auxiliaries, soldiers in Roman service. Now they were refugees, and worse, forgotten ones. Among the elders, words passed in quiet tones. Some spoke of Visigothic chieftains beginning to question Roman authority. Others said the treaty had never been real, that they had only ever been used. The word Federati was no longer spoken with pride, but with bitterness. In the distance, across the plains and down the long straight roads, the great amphitheatre of Rome still stood, silent, waiting. Its stone arches had seen no games. Its sand had not yet been soaked, but it had been built for a reason, and that reason was coming closer. Chapter 5. The Emperor marches. The silence did not end with words. It ended with footsteps. Across the field south of Rome, the dry summer grass bowed not to wind, but to the march of Rome's highest office. At last, the Emperor moved. Horses, carts, infantry, and staff officers, a slow but unmistakable procession rolling out from imperial estates toward the road. He did not ride in triumph. He did not speak to crowds. But make no mistake, the Emperor had decided to be seen. Marcus Aurelius Probus, wreathed in laurels, clad in the deep crimson of imperial command, rode beneath a golden standard that bore no slogans, no praise. It shimmered against the dust like a warning. His eyes stayed forward. He did not look at the villas they passed, not at the bowed heads of farmers, not at the lines of Gothic migrants camped along the hedgerows. he rode with the burden of a throne that had been too quiet for too long. The news had reached him not from the Senate, but from his scouts. Broken roads, empty garrisons, refugees who once called themselves allies, now sharpening blades beside empty grain carts. Rome's governors had hesitated, its commanders had bickered, but the emperor no longer had the luxury of silence. His march was not a spectacle, it was a recalibration. Behind him came the cavalry, not the glittering riders of ceremony, but real men, hardened by long postings in Gaul and the East. Dust clung to their cloaks, spears rattled in the sockets. Alongside them marched an elite cohort, drawn from the Praetorian Guard, their armour burnished but not clean. These were not parade troops. They were a message. Each mile marked a shift in Rome's posture. Where once the imperial absence had spoken volumes, now the emperor's movement became a language of its own. Bridges were inspected, milestones recorded, letters handed to local officials and sealed with the signet of the eagle. Nothing was said in public, but everywhere he passed, silence gave way to motion. Citizens reappeared, doors opened, soldiers straightened. And yet, not all was order. As the column approached the plains west of Tibur, modern-day Tivoli, word reached them of a confrontation. A Roman patrol had blocked a Gothic caravan from crossing a bridge. There had been shouting, rocks thrown, a child injured, no one killed. Not yet. But the tension was stretching. Probus listened in silence as the report was read. Then he simply raised one finger, and the column resumed its pace. No speech, no command, just movement. Because sometimes an emperor doesn't need to roar. Sometimes he just needs to march. Marcus Aurelius Probus, commander, emperor, and former frontier general, did not ride into Rome. Not yet. Instead, his column veered east, following the quiet bend of the Anio River. The capital lay within reach, its towers blurred beyond the summer haze, but the road Probus chose was deliberate. He was not returning to be hailed. He was repositioning power, and he began with the army. At the 10th milestone, they halted near a forgotten watchtower, its upper stones blackened by time. Probus dismounted without a word. Around him gathered a dozen hardened centurions, officers from every province. One had served in the highlands of Dacia, another along the Persian frontier. Some wore older armour patched with foreign leather. Others bore scars from uprisings in Mauritania and Pannonia. Few had ever stood in the same formation before, but all knew the weight of command. The emperor circled them slowly, his steps crunching through gravel and sun-dried grass. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear. "Rome is not asleep," he said. "She is watching, through us." No cheers followed. These were not senators seeking approval. They were fieldmen, professionals. One nodded, another clenched a jaw. A third, an imperial notarius, part of the elite cadre of record-keepers trained to follow emperors in the field, lowered his stylus and sealed the quote into wax. Probus issued no proclamations. Instead, he began to divide his force. A mixed cohort of auxilia and legionaries was dispatched to the Via Latina to secure a forward supply post. A smaller detachment of scouts rode southeast toward Anagnia to inspect granaries and interview local traders. Another was quietly sent west to investigate rumours that some of the Gothic migrants were trading heirlooms for blades and wine. These were not preparations for a parade. These were field operations. Across the hills, smoke began to rise, early campfires, sentry stations, and field kitchens being assembled on ancient farmland. Tents sprouted like thistles. The air filled with the smells of boiled spelt, worn leather, and iron pulled fresh from oiled sheaths. Rome's silence was over. Its discipline had returned. And yet, the emperor did not retreat to comfort. That night, Probus slept in a campaign tent beside his senior officers, as he had during frontier postings years before. His sword rested beside him, unsheathed, not for ritual, but for readiness. He did not speak of war, but he prepared for it. Rumours drifted through the camp by torchlight. A Gothic envoy had sent word, requesting terms. A smaller group had reportedly broken from the main caravan, heading into the Alban Hills under cover of fog. The scouts had not returned, and still Probus gave no speech. He listened, he observed, he acted. And as soldiers rotated through sentry posts, as dispatch riders moved like ants across the roads, the horizon still held its ancient shape. In the west, beyond pine groves and torchlit hills, the Colosseum remained untouched, not yet bloodied, not yet awakened. But Rome was stirring, and the stone would not stay clean forever. Chapter 6. The Road to Recovery. The Empire could not afford another mistake. Word had spread of the Emperor's march, not by proclamation, but by whispers, carried on merchant carts and scrawled hastily on tavern walls. Probus had moved. The army was active. And Rome, for the first time in months, felt as though it might breathe again. But breath alone would not hold the frontiers, nor feed the columns of displaced peoples inching their way across Italy. In the form of Trajan, beneath weathered marble and the watchful eyes of bronze emperors, envoys met in private. They were not senators in white togas. These were grain merchants, military quartermasters, former magistrates now reactivated under imperial writ. Rome's political theatre had grown quiet. It was now a logistical war. The task was clear: stabilize the food supply, reinforce the road networks, and avoid bloodshed. Storehouses once left idle were now being inventoried. Salted pork and amphorae of wheat, stacked floor to ceiling, were checked against old ledgers. Carts were requisitioned, draft animals pulled from noble stables. And most quietly of all, temples were opened, not for worship, but for rations. South of Rome, near the Appian Way, Roman engineers worked shoulder to shoulder with Gothic labourers. No orders had been issued. They simply began. Perhaps it was survival instinct. Perhaps it was something else. The road had cracked during the spring rains, and now, beneath the late summer sun, it was being rebuilt, stone by stone. One veteran, discharged after service in Syria, handed a chisel to a boy no older than 12. The boy said nothing. He began to carve. In the hills near Praeneste, a Roman tribune named Verenius, recently reinstated after a provincial scandal, oversaw the erection of a makeshift bridge. His orders were clear: restore access to the eastern vineyards and do it without drawing troops from the main force. He complied. Quietly, thoroughly. Recovery, Probus knew, was not declared. It was earned. And all the while the Colosseum remained quiet. Its gates locked, its corridors swept but empty. A monument to what Rome could still control, the narrative of waiting. But beyond the city walls, the weight of movement had shifted. The Empire was preparing, not just to survive, but to restore something that had slipped. Not glory, but rhythm. Not all repairs were made with stone. Some were made in hallways, over half-spoken promises, and in rooms where sunlight barely touched the floor. Rome had begun to move, but it was not unified. Beneath the calm of supply chains and rebuilt roads, the old rivalries remained. In the halls of the Curia Julia, 2 senators whispered beneath a statue of Concordia. One favoured appeasement, offering land and food to the Gothic migrants in exchange for silence. The other saw opportunity. Starvation breeds fear, and fear breeds submission. Neither spoke above a whisper. Neither admitted to knowing what Probus intended, but both knew that Rome's outer calm was fragile. Beyond the walls, in scattered provinces, governors wrote letters they did not send. Some requested grain, Others asked for troops. A few, still waiting for their replacements, simply reported that they would act in the Empire's best interest, whatever that meant. Yet, while politics hesitated, the people moved. Near Terracina, Gothic women traded woven blankets for olive oil. In the markets of Arretium, a Roman soldier offered 3 denarii for a ring carved from deer bone, its Gothic symbols worn but elegant. Children played in the dust near the edge of an unfinished road, chasing each other with sticks, unaware that this peace was still temporary. Further north, a small riot broke out near Florentia. Locals had accused a Gothic family of stealing cured meat. No one was killed, but the crowd left behind broken carts and blood on the stones. A magistrate recorded the event in silence. When the report reached Rome, it was marked for internal review. No one acted, and still no games were called. The amphitheatre stood as it had for months, untouched. Guards patrolled its arches. The sand in the arena was swept daily, though no footsteps crossed it. Rumours claimed wild beasts had already been delivered and locked away below, though no one confirmed it. The Colosseum had become more than stone. It was now a promise, a warning, a statement of control waiting to be declared. And for the Empire to make that statement, Rome had to appear ready, not to celebrate peace, but to perform power. Not yet, but soon. Chapter 7. The Peace That Wasn't. The summer sun softened as the days shortened, but there was no cooling in Rome's unease. Word spread that an agreement had been reached, a settlement, a compromise, a peace. But few knew what had truly been agreed. Fewer believed it would last. Officially, the Gothic caravans were to remain outside the city, beyond the southern vineyards, in the marshy stretch near Arretium. Grain would be distributed weekly, water transported from auxiliary cisterns, tents erected by soldiers and hired labourers. Rome would supply, the Goths would wait. Unofficially, the lines blurred. Children from the encampment wandered toward nearby villages, barefoot and curious. A Roman widow from Tusculum was seen delivering goat cheese to a group of Gothic mothers. A centurion reported that tools from the city storehouse had been borrowed for fence repairs. None of it had been sanctioned, none of it punished. In theory, this was a peaceful holding pattern. In practice, it was a test. Marcus Aurelius Probus, still operating from his field command post near the Anio River, kept Rome at arm's length. He sent envoys, not declarations. One of them, a grizzled official named Aelius Severinus, had once overseen refugee settlements in Cappadocia. Now he walked the temporary streets of the Gothic camp with dust in his beard and a dagger hidden beneath his scrolls. His job was not to inspect, it was to listen. He noted the hunger, the absence of elders, the sharp eyes of younger men watching Roman supply wagons too closely. He counted how many had horses, how many carried knives, how many still wore belts from fallen Roman auxiliaries. And he knew, this was not peace, it was a pause. Back in the city, the Colosseum remained unused, not out of fear, but out of caution. To fill its seats now would be to pretend Rome had nothing to fear. That would be a lie. The arena had become a stage for Rome's restraint. The longer it stayed silent, the louder its message. We are still in control. But silence has limits, and Rome had just drawn a line in sand that would not hold through autumn winds. Chapter 8, When Water Turns to Ash. The first cries came with the light. Not of pain, but of vendors, pulling carts through the sloped alleys leading to the Colosseum. Bronze pans clattered, bread baked with cumin and lard steamed in linen sacks. Below the tiered arches, crowds pressed in, not wild, not ravenous, but expectant. Rome had not seen a day like this in months. The Colosseum stood ready. Over 50 meters high, its travertine skin glowed pale gold in the morning haze. The awnings, vela, were already stretched wide above the seats, held taut by the rigging of sailors from Misenum. Sunlight filtered through in bars, casting striped shadows onto polished marble benches. Inside, the arena smelled of sawdust and oil. Fresh sand had been spread over the floor, coarse African grains mixed with powdered chalk to soak blood and sweat. Between the trapdoors below, ropes creaked, pulleys clicked. Slaves in the hypodrome, Rome's underground staging chamber, prepared the day's choreography. Gladiators did not enter as prisoners. They rose like a chorus. From grated lifts and shadowed stairways emerged men trained in the ludi, gladiatorial schools operated by lanistae, private managers who leased their fighters to games. Most of these men were not slaves sentenced to die. They were professionals, fighters, athletes. Some were volunteers drawn by coin or glory. Others had once been soldiers, now retrained with a new sword, a new code. Their armor was precise. Mamios wore crested helmets and rectangular scuta. Thraces bore curved seeker blades and high greaves. The Hoplomachus, modelled after Greek warriors, carried spears and round shields. No piece was theatrical. It was standardized, regulated, and issued by the ludus, much like a military kit. The crowd murmured as they took position. Some gladiators raised their swords in salute, not to the emperor, but to the editor of the games. The editor, not the people, held the power of life or death. And even that was rarely used. Most matches did not end in death. To lose was not to die, but to submit, marked by lifting 2 fingers in missio. The crowd might chant, they might hiss, but the final call rested with the editor. Gladiators were investments, months of training, expensive equipment, medical staff. A dead fighter meant lost coin. The modern myth of thumbs down is a fiction born centuries later. Roman sources describe a turned thumb, pollis verso, but whether it pointed up, down, or to the side remains unclear. What is known, death was the exception, not the rule. Trumpets blared. The first match began. A Mamios squared off against a Retiarius, the net fighter with trident and dagger. They circled. Sand shifted underfoot. Cheers pulsed like waves. Leather met iron. A shield cracked. The Mamilo fell, tangled in netting. He raised 2 fingers. Missio granted. Applause rippled, not bloodthirsty, but measured. A chorus master signalled with a wand, guiding the tempo of cheers. The victor circled, saluted, and left through the gate of life. The defeated limped toward the infirmary, past physicians trained in battlefield triage. Above it all, from his imperial box, Probus watched without expression. This was not celebration, it was calibration. Rome was remembering itself, not through policy, but through rhythm, through spectacle wrapped in order. The games had returned. But beneath the incense and pageantry, something had shifted. The Colosseum no longer felt like a monument. It felt like a mask to hide the rising smoke curling from the hills beyond. The sun rose higher, and with it, the temperature inside the Colosseum swelled. The shadows beneath the awnings grew sharper. Across the marble seats, citizens fanned themselves with folded linen or scraps of papyrus. The scent of sweat mingled with roasted pine nuts and the sharp tang of vinegar-soaked greens sold in clay bowls. Down below, the arena sand was no longer pale. Footprints trailed in spirals. Specks of blood dotted the surface, not from slaughter, but from glancing wounds. A gladius strike to the thigh, a shield rim across the nose, a misstep on loose sand. Near the east gate, a young Mamilo sat with his back to the wall. A medical slave knelt beside him, wrapping his ankle in cloth soaked with wine. No one spoke. Pain was treated quickly, then replaced with silence. This wasn't theatre. This was labour. Regulated, contracted, and observed. In the lower chambers, the the next performers stood in half-light. Venatores, the beast hunters. Not gladiators in the traditional sense, but trained specialists. Most were condemned criminals or freedmen used for animal hunts. Venationes that thrilled the audience. Except today, the spectacle had thinned. Rome's supply lines were faltering. There were no lions, no elephants, no crocodiles from Egyptus. Only 2 aging boars and a bear with a scarred snout. The gates opened. A boar rushed forward, tusks glinting, foam on its mouth. One venator caught its side with a spear, but the second stumbled. The crowd gasped. The hunter rolled, the boar turned. Then another spear found its mark. The animal collapsed, twitching, steaming, and silent. Some clapped, some did not. The bear was worse. Confused, malnourished. It emerged blinking, then paced toward the shade. The fight never happened. The animal was led away, and the crowd jeered. This was not what they had come for. Above it all, Probus sat motionless in the imperial box. He wore no laurel, gave no signal. Behind him stood 2 notary, imperial scribes, observing, recording, perhaps whispering. Something was wrong beyond the arena. Grain ships had not arrived from Ostia. Smoke had been sighted south of Tibur. Scouts had not returned from the Alban Hills. Inside the Colosseum, order held, but just barely. A gladiator brushed past a column. The paint on its base had begun to flake. In the upper tiers, a section of awning came loose, whipping in the wind. An official scrambled to secure it, his tunic stained with pitch. The illusion of perfection began to fray. And still the crowd clapped. It was reflex now, not joy, not awe, just motion. Because the Colosseum had never just been entertainment. It was reassurance. Rome's great mirror, reflecting not who the city was, but who it insisted on being. Unified, controlled, eternal. But outside, on the horizon, the wind carried the wrong kind of ash. The arena floor was cleared. The next games would begin tomorrow. If there was a tomorrow to begin with. Chapter 9. Rebuilding the Broken Line. At the heart of every empire lies a symbol. For Rome, it was the Colosseum. Stone and shadow, arches carved in power. But symbols do not guard borders, they must be backed by motion. And so, while the arena stood silent in the capital, far from its blood-stained sand, soldiers rode east to restore the line that held it all together. Probus, emperor and former frontier general, had not returned to Rome for spectacle. He returned to stabilize the image Rome projected to the world. And the Colosseum, that grand machine of public control, required more than marble to function. It needed grain, peace, order. So, when his scouts reported a weakening of the Via Prenestina, he did not hesitate. A column was dispatched before dawn, carrying engineers, surveyors, and a cohort of seasoned auxilia. Their goal was not conquest, but continuity. If Rome's arenas were to fill again, if games were to resume and spectators to cheer, then the outer arteries had to be cleared, fortified, fed. They reached a long-forgotten outpost by midday. A crumbling watchtower overlooked the valley, its stones looted long ago for peasant ovens and village altars. Nearby, a rusted milestone still bore the faint inscription of an earlier emperor, one who had also tried to hold the line. By nightfall, fires burned along the ridge. Men repaired walls using fragments of collapsed villas. Tiles once part of bathhouses now protected grain storage. An old marble basin, once used for ritual washing, was repurposed to mix lime mortar. This was not restoration. This was function. All of it, ultimately, served Rome's image. The games would return, and the crowd, soothed by spectacle, would believe that nothing had changed. But outside the city, work told the truth. At the edge of the Palatine Hill, beyond the groves of fig and laurel, the Colosseum stirred. Stone arches, long silent, now echoed with voices. Workers shouting measurements, iron clanging against scaffolds, carts creaking under loads of imported sand. The arena was not preparing for a grand festival. Not yet. But it was waking. Inside, the heat clung to the walls like old breath. Slaves hauled buckets of crushed pumice and vinegar, scrubbing faint stains that had darkened the travertine blocks. Sand from Tunisia, fine and pale, replaced the old layer soaked through with years of sweat and blood. One foreman muttered that it still smelled of copper. Another laughed. That's Rome. Overhead, workers on narrow planks mended the velarium, the massive canvas awning that shaded the upper tiers. Its ropes, dyed crimson and gold, stretched like veins across the sky. They had been woven in Antioch, reinforced in Alexandria, and shipped through Ostia with orders sealed by the emperor himself. This was not theatre, it was message. Below, two young architects paced the podium, the network of tunnels beneath the sand. They pointed to rusted pulleys and broken lift shafts where wild beasts had once emerged to the roar of 50,000. Few had been maintained. Most had not been used in decades. One of the lifts groaned as it was tested. It failed. They moved on. No one had announced a full schedule of games, but word had spread. The emperor was watching, and perhaps, the people would watch again too. Outside, a cohort of praetorians stood at ease beneath a shaded portico. A notarius unrolled a scroll and quietly listed expenses aloud. Timber, oil, new tunics for the arena stewards, a fresh coat of paint for the imperial box. Everything had to be flawless, especially if the event would be modest. A quiet show, if it came, would still be judged like a triumph. On the upper tier, a mason paused, staring across the city. Rome had changed. Markets were thinner, roads more cracked. But here, under this arch, beneath this sky, the past still echoed. In the shade of the Colosseum's belly, an old man selling figs leaned on his cart. Used to be, he muttered to a passerby. The games brought the whole empire home. Now it's just ropes and dust. He didn't look angry, just tired. But he stayed. That night, torchlight flickered along the outer wall. Guards moved like shadows, and inside, the sand was still again. Fresh, raked, silent. The Colosseum was not roaring, but it was ready to breathe. Chapter 10. Beneath the Arena. The Colosseum stood, not as a monument, but as a mechanism. Beneath its perfect elliptical shell, every stone had once served motion, not memory. And now, under the emperor's renewed patronage, that machinery rumbled again. But few in Rome knew what truly lay below. The Hippodrome, its name meaning underground, was a labyrinth of cells, tunnels, and shafts, hidden beneath the arena floor. Constructed decades after the original amphitheatre opened, it had transformed the spectacles forever. With over 32 elevators and trapdoors, the arena became a stage of controlled illusion. Elephants rose on hidden lifts. Wolves lunged from shadowed gates. Scenery, temples, forests, shipwrecks emerged through smoke in seconds. Beneath the blood and applause was an army of stagehands, winch operators, and slave engineers, their labour unseen, their timing exact. Each event required days of preparation, calculated like a campaign. But by now, many of the old lifts groaned or jammed. Wooden rails had split, iron pivots rusted, and the men assigned to reactivate them worked in silence, their hands black with oil and dust. No audience would cheer them. No record would bear their names. Above, the arena was not bare. It had been treated, raked, resanded, scented. The top layer came from the deserts of Cyrenaica, chosen for its pale colour and its ability to absorb both blood and sunlight. Sometimes perfumed petals were scattered between shows to sweeten the air. Fountains misted the upper levels, cooling the crowd when the shade sails failed. And beneath the seats, in the vomitoria, the passageways that funneled up to 50,000 spectators in and out in minutes, vendors sharpened knives and hawked sausages, cheese and wine. A festival, a ritual, a system. Every inch of the Colosseum had a function. The seats themselves were mapped to society. Senators sat nearest the sand. Knights followed. Ordinary Roman citizens filled the middle decks, and women and slaves were banished to the top. Unless they fought, of course. Gladiatrices, rare and controversial, had once drawn wild applause from the upper rows. But those days had passed. The games themselves were not endless death matches. Contrary to later myth, gladiators were rarely killed. They were investments, owned by lanistae, professional trainers who ran ludi, or gladiator schools, across the empire. Each fighter represented training, coin, and prestige. To kill one in a single show was wasteful. The crowd still loved drama, yes, but blood was rationed. And then there was the thumb. Modern myth holds that emperors decided life or death with a dramatic turn of the hand, thumb up or down. But ancient sources contradict this. The likely gesture was pollis verso, a turned thumb, possibly pointing horizontally to signal mercy, or extended upward like a blade to indicate death. What mattered was not the emperor's flair, but the ritualized moment, the suspense, the performance. Now, in this late hour of the empire, with borders fragile and whispers of rebellion in the hills, the Colosseum still offered its service. Not just as entertainment, but as control. It kept the people seated, distracted, thrilled. It reminded them who ruled and how. A city on edge might riot. A crowd fed bread and spectacle might cheer instead. Yet something had shifted. The stone no longer gleamed. Vines crept along its western flank. Statues once placed in its arches had been removed, melted, stolen. And the great bronze cross in the centre, a later addition by the Christian emperors, stood as a symbol of Rome's new conscience. One that was beginning to question whether this place, this ancient engine of violence, still belonged in the soul of the city. But for now, the dust was swept. The ropes were pulled, the torches were lit, and the arena waited. The Colosseum outlasted the empire that had raised it. By the late 4th century, the thunder of the games had begun to fade. Gladiators, once celebrated across provinces, were vanishing. Exotic beasts that once roamed the sand grew costly to import. The imperial economy buckled under military strain, and the old rituals of public entertainment no longer masked the disintegration of state power. But the Colosseum did not die with the games. It endured, it transformed. Its corridors echoed with new sounds, not the roars of crowds or the growls of leopards, but the tread of military boots and the clang of chains being hauled upward into the upper levels. As the empire fractured and civil wars ignited, the Colosseum was repurposed. Its architecture, built for flow and control, was now a shield. Defenders fortified the structure, hauling up siege engines, stockpiling weapons, turning upper arches into platforms for archers and ballistae. These upper arches had once housed the lowest classes of Roman society, women, slaves, the poor, relegated to wooden bleachers far above the sand. Now they became high ground, strategic positions. From these heights, arrows rained down into Rome's streets, covering retreats, fending off skirmishes, and repelling threats from within and without. Inside, the arena was changing. The sand decayed. Rain collapsed sections of the wooden floor, exposing the hypogeum beneath. Those shadowed labyrinths, once used to hide animals, prisoners, and the men who triggered the stage machinery of death. Now, this underworld lay open to the sky, its stone corridors flooded, its purpose long abandoned. When earthquakes struck in the 5th and 9th centuries, they cracked great portions of the southern wall. Entire columns came loose and fell. The damage was never repaired. In the centuries that followed, the people of Rome turned to the Colosseum as a quarry. Its stones, perfectly cut, tested by time, were stripped and carried off to build palaces, churches, bridges. Much of Romanesque and medieval Rome, from basilicas to bell towers, was literally built on its bones. Even the iron clamps that once locked its masonry together were pried loose. Workers dug them out and melted them down. They left behind rows of small square holes, pockmarks still visible today. What looked like decay was not simply time. It was theft, survival, and transformation. Yet through all this, the Colosseum remained. By the 11th century, the powerful Frangipani family seized control of the structure and converted it into a fortress. Towers were added, portcullises lowered. Rooms once used by gladiators became armories. The arena floor, now long gone, was a courtyard. From empire to private stronghold, the amphitheatre became a citadel. Later, it became something else again, a slum. By the 14th century, dozens of families lived inside the ruin. Shacks were built in its arches, chickens roamed its stairwells. Children played in spaces where once lions had roared. The very poor of medieval Rome found refuge where senators had once reclined in marble seats. And with the rise of Christianity, a new layer of memory was laid across the stone. Though no reliable ancient evidence confirms that Christian martyrs died in the Colosseum, medieval belief held that they had. The idea alone gave the site new meaning. A cross was raised in the arena. Popes visited, pilgrims prayed. The Colosseum was no longer just an arena. It was a relic, a scar, a symbol. In the Renaissance, antiquarians began measuring its stones. Artists sketched its fractured arches. For scholars rediscovering classical Rome, the Colosseum stood as both wonder and warning, a monument to greatness, yes, but also to violence, decay, and pride turned to dust. And still it stands. Through empire and anarchy, through plunder and prayer, through centuries of rain, tremors, and blood memory, the Colosseum endures. No longer to thrill the masses, but to remind us, quietly, irrevocably, that nothing built for power ever survives without change. It is not complete, it is not pristine, but it is real, and it remembers everything